if we were to ask 1,000 biblical scholars, what are the Gospels? Who wrote them? Who is the audience? What is unique about each one? When were they written? And then a little bit about the historicity. That's what this is going to be. So this is on aggregate. If you were to ask a bunch of biblical scholars, you would fall somewhere in these ranges. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Starting with Matthew. Matthew, Mark, and Luke being the synoptic gospels, meaning the same, because they basically are. And John being kind of this whimsical, different gospel that just happens to be also the latest one. But Matthew, the focus of it was Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy and the promised Messiah. There's argument there, but that's fringe, so we won't go into it. But just so you know, just so I'm honest. Who is the audience? This would be predominantly for Jewish Christians. And if you read Matthew, the real edge to it is the author is really pushing towards bringing Jewish context and commonality to the gospel. So, which is a really interesting thing to do. If you read Mark next to Matthew, there are stark contrasts and differences because the audiences were entirely different and the authors were entirely different. So the authors had different things they wanted to push, and that's just the reality. So the gospel writer of Matthew is really pushing Jewish context. This is why we get some of the contradictions in the Gospels, where in Matthew, for example, we're told to pretty clearly stick to Jewish law. The Jewish law matters. And yet in some of the other Gospels and in the epistles from Paul, there's this no Jewish law. Jewish law is completely gone. It's been fulfilled. None of that has any place with us currently. Matthew disagrees. Matthew pushes it pretty hard. Some of the unique things about Matthew, we have the genealogy that links Jesus to David and Abraham. That's important for case building for who Jesus was. You have extensive use of Old Testament references because, again, there's a huge Jewish context to this gospel writer. He really was nailing down on the Jewish commonalities. And you also have the Sermon on the Mount, which is important, which it was also something you have in the Gospel of Luke, and it's identical. When was the Gospel of Matthew produced? Probably somewhere between 80 and 90 AD, likely towards the end of this range. I will add that likely towards the end of this range, your super religious scholars will probably disagree. They'll probably say it was around 80 for obvious reasons. They have a reason to want it to be earlier because there's some issues with it and some of the other Gospels, Mark specifically. But from what I understand and I find personally opinion to be the most compelling is that it was either in the late 80s or real close to 90 itself. It doesn't make a dramatic difference, but it does make a difference when you are trying to assert certain things about some of the stuff we're going to talk about later. Historicity. It contains material that is shared with Mark and Luke, which I already said were what we call the synoptic gospel because they have commonality. A lot of things are verbatim identical, and a lot of things are same story told in a different way, different details, but same sequence. There are also unique traditions like the nativity story, which is interesting. That's its own thing. One of the things that, I guess real quick, actually, if you don't know a lot about the synoptic gospels and you don't know what Q is, I recommend watching the thing I just posted yesterday about Q. It's called The Gospels Copied to Other Ancient Texts. And on the thumbnail, it says Q Gospel. What is it? On Tattooed Theist. The Q Gospel is important to understand because the synoptic Gospels, Luke and Matthew specifically, obviously use sources. There's really no disagreement that they used Mark as a source because Mark was produced first. So these gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, had Mark's gospel and they used it when writing their gospels. We know for a fact. I don't know of any scholars worth their weight that don't agree with that. Most scholars also believe that he used something that we call the Q gospel, which is it's quella, which means I believe it's Latin. No, it's not Latin. I think it's German. But it means source is all that it means. So Q gospel is a hypothetical gospel. that we believe Matthew and Luke both copied certain things from, specifically the sayings of Jesus. We do not have the Q gospel, but scholars have done a lot of really good work to try to reconstruct it by using other gospels like Matthew and Luke, and like some of the Apocrypha gospels, because they have things that seem to be from whatever the same document is that scholars call Q. So that's important to kind of understand. So that would be something to go watch at some point if you want more context on that. Mark, which is the first gospel, the focus of it was Jesus as the suffering servant and Son of God. There is a stark contrast between Matthew, Luke, and John when compared to Mark in the realm of divinity of Jesus. Mark doesn't seem to push this idea. Mark doesn't really use that kind of language. Mark uses language like the Son of God, really kind of pressing that Jesus was special. Jesus was a prophet at least. Jesus was something to be taken seriously, but he doesn't really push this idea that Jesus was God himself, but rather that Jesus was, he came from God, was the Son of God. That's another video I'm doing soon, is the titles of Jesus in the Gospels. Do any of them actually claim that he is God? And I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying this is the type of stuff that I've been going through lately. So I'll do that soon too. But Mark has a very firm focus on Jesus as the suffering servant and of the Son of God. Who Mark was writing to was likely Roman Christians, who specifically at the time were under persecution. So unlike Matthew, who's pushing Jewish context really hard, Mark is not. Mark lacks a lot of, if for the most part, any Jewish context being pushed on the audience. Some of the unique things about Mark is that it's very fast. It's quick. It's action to action to action. There's not these long, lengthy things. It's pretty fast. There's less teaching like Matthew and Luke. There are more miracles, and it is our shortest gospel account. The date, generally considered the earliest gospel, and this is really generous. I don't know anybody who's ever said, ever, that Mark is not the first gospel account. Usually dated around 65 to 70. Some will date it at 60. I don't think I've seen anything earlier than 60, though. Most scholars place it within a year or two of the ending of the Jewish war. And so here's some Marcion. If you remember when we did Marcion, we talked about his story. Right around the time is the most prevalent period of Marcion as a character and the compilation of the New Testament. Just something to consider. It was roughly around that period, loosely. Historicity, likely based on Peter's eyewitness testimony. That's somewhat agreed upon, depending on who you talk to. See, it's also seen as the foundation for Matthew and Luke, like we already briefly touched on. Mark was a source. Matthew and Luke absolutely used Mark's gospel when writing their own. Then you have Luke. Jesus is the compassionate savior for all people, including Gentiles. So in Luke, you have some of the Jewish stuff. You have a lot of the Gentile push, the non-Jewish Christians. Who he was writing to seems to be predominantly those, the Gentile Christians, but it is wider. So there is a lot, not a lot. There is some of the Jewish context in there. It seems like he's writing to a more generalized audience. Some of the unique things is that we do have a detailed birth narrative. This is the shepherds and angels. This is where we get a lot of the Christmas time stories and depictions from. The parables, like the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, are unique. And obviously everybody kind of knows these stories, so they're important to a degree at least. When was it written is close to Matthew, around the same time. Most put it around 80 to 90. So I would still say, which I put there, is that it's likely towards the end of that range, because that is what I personally believe. That is my opinion. Historicity claims to be an orderly account. Luke 1:1-4 specifically says that detailed accounts of Jesus Christ have already been written, but I, the author of Luke, am going to try to put together a orderly account for you, my what does he say? Something Theophilus. He like calls him my beautiful Theophilus. That's not the word, but something similar to that. That's something to be aware of too, is that Luke very blatantly says he's using sources. And most people are like, what are you talking about? It's right there in the very beginning. And I went into that in that video too, about the Gospel of Q. But Luke straight up says, I'm using sources. Accounts have already been written. My aim is to make them orderly and to present them to, he was talking to Theophilus, so it's specifically for him. I'm creating you an orderly account, Theophilus, so that you can be confident in what you believe, is what he says. It shocks me how many people don't know that. It's right at the very beginning. The book of John, and then I'll look and see if I'm missing anything in the chat. I just don't want to lose the run here. John is the last one. The focus is on Jesus as being divine. So the later in history these gospels go, the more divine Jesus becomes in terms of written accounts. Mark, I would argue none. Matthew and Luke, you get hints of it. John, boom, divinity's there. So Jesus as the divine logos, the eternal Son of God. We get a lot more whimsical spiritual language in the Gospel of John. Who he was writing to is likely a mix of Jewish and Gentile Christians, and he has a very, very keen theological emphasis on his gospel. It becomes more theological as time goes on. Mark, almost none. Matthew and Luke, some. John, a whole lot of it. Very theological. Some of the unique features, besides those things I just said, the theological reflections, we have more I am statements, which is specific in divinity of Christ. It's one of the big arguments where Jesus says, I am. Big deal. And then focus on signs or miracles and a lot of discourse in John, a lot of talking. Likely written between 90 and 100 AD. So again, being the last of the Gospels. This Gospel being the latest on the timeline also happens to be the most whimsical of all the Gospels. Much of the theology we derive as Christians is predominantly taken from John. Just driving that home because it's important. Historicity, significantly different from the synoptics, raising debates about its historical versus theological intentions, because it really does seem as though the theological is the only thing that matters almost in John. But it does copy or pull from the earlier Gospels in terms of some of the historical accounts. Okay, all that being said, let me see if I missed anything important, and then we'll move on to more detailed historicity. I hope that clip was informational. If it wasn't, I hope it was at least kind of amusing or entertaining in some fashion. Either way, if you want to watch the full live stream, you can click right here. We do a number of these live streams every week on 2 different YouTube channels, at Tattooed Theist and at Live Bible Study. If you click the link to our Discord server in the description below, there's an events page there that shows you where and when all the live streams are. You'll also then be a part, whether you like it or not, of our dysfunctionally beautiful Discord family.